Theme 2: General theories regarding the learning and acquisition of a foreign language, the concept of interlanguage, analysis and correction of errors. Index. Introduction. Relation with other themes. Current legislation. The contribution of linguistics to language teaching. Language acquisition. Children versus adults. The situation in Spain. Stages in the acquisition process. Theories of language acquisition. Interference of the mother tongue. Analysis and correction of errors. Conclusion applicable to language teaching. Relevant bibliography. The theme I have chosen is number 2, which deals mainly with the learning and acquisition of a foreign language. In the first place, I will talk about the differences between learning and acquisition, mentioning how children acquire their own mother tongue and the different stages in this acquisition process. I will examine some of the theories that linguists have put forward to explain this process, before explaining how the mother tongue can interfere with the learning of a second language. Finally, I will talk about the analysis and correction of errors, and I will finish with a conclusion relating the content of this theme to its practical application in our secondary classes. This theme is directly related to others, especially number 1, which deals with the evolution of language teaching, and numbers 3 to 6, which cover different aspects regarding the acquisition of communicative competence. The Improved Organic Law of Education, the LOMLOE, came into force in 2021 and has now been introduced in secondary education. The law deals comprehensively with the most suitable type of methodology to be implemented in our secondary school classes. The official curriculum of the Autonomous Community of Madrid contains detailed information about this. All of this is established and supported by the Council of Europe in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. I will begin my theme by talking generally about the contribution of linguistics to foreign language teaching. Linguistics is the systematic study of language, and the findings in several of its fields must be considered when it comes to teaching a foreign language efficiently. Areas such as phonology, syntax, and semantics have been investigated from the earliest periods, but one of the branches of this discipline that has developed most in recent years is psycholinguistics. This is the study of the mental process underlying the act of speech, and one of its most important outcomes has been the study of language acquisition in children, the main topic of this theme. We always refer to the fact that we learn our own mother tongue first and then start to study foreign languages at school, but this is not necessarily the case. Most children begin to communicate in their mother tongue from an early age, and they do so without ever having been taught any grammar rules. How does this happen? Quite simply, it is a natural process of exposure to the language and imitation of it, what we know of as acquisition. It is a well-known fact that children find it easier than adults to pick up a foreign language. The older we are, the more difficult it becomes. How many times have we ourselves had problems with constructions in English, generally caused by the fact that our brains are conditioned to thinking first of the structure in Spanish and then translating it into English? Very often, the methods used to teach us foreign languages leave a lot to be desired. There is usually too much emphasis on grammar and translation, and not enough on the communicative language we need to use in a variety of situations. Here in Spain, foreign languages are now being introduced from the age of 3, an excellent idea if children are given the right conditions. What will almost certainly happen, unfortunately, is that primary school teachers will attempt to teach the foreign language to children, either through a series of grammatical rules or by focusing primarily on vocabulary instead of just relying on the children's incredible capacity to understand speech from an early age. We can see how quickly youngsters start to use computers, whereas older people often have serious problems adapting to new technological developments. The basic requirement when it comes to acquiring a language is the ability to understand the speech of others and then produce it in a spontaneous way. Do children always understand what we are saying? This is extremely doubtful. We only have to look at an example to see that they probably do not understand completely sentences at an early age, but just pick up relevant words and associate them with things like intonation to take in the message. If a mother says to her 2-year-old son, "Go and get your pajamas from under the pillow and put them on," it is highly unlikely that the boy can understand such a complex construction, especially when employing a transitive phrasal verb. What the child would grasp here, however, is the word pajamas, know where they are kept, and realize that it is time for bed. Acquisition of one's mother tongue comes in stages. It is a process of listening, imitation, and repetition. We learn to speak by copying what we hear, even to the extent that we end up with the same accent of our parents, family, and friends. There is no evidence to suggest that young children have any idea of grammatical forms. Indeed, it is a waste of time teaching them correct constructions. Even later in life we can see this. Many English adults still think that the conditional perfect is would have instead of would have, caused by the fact that they have always heard the weak form would have. We could just as easily find the same problem in Spanish adults who confuse haber with haber. The first stage is what is known as the babbling stage. Here, babies start to babble, that is to say, they produce monosyllabic sounds like ka and then go on to repeat the syllable to produce dada or tutu. Some basic form of grammar appears when children start to use verbs like gone, nouns like cat, or pronouns like me. This is where children somehow begin to appreciate the importance of things like intonation. A child may well say "dada" with rising intonation if he hears the door opening, "dada" with falling intonation when he says that it is his father, and "dada" with level intonation when he holds his arms out to give his father a hug. Around the age of a year and a half, children start to string two or more words together, forming intelligible sequences. We could hear things like "mummyful" or "doggy bad" or "here daddy", and of course we would instantly recognize what the child was conveying. Sentences tend to be longer after the age of 2, although there is still no real grammar. Articles and the verb "to be" have still not appeared, neither have verbal endings. A typical sentence at this stage would be something like "Baby watch telly", meaning that the baby is watching the television. After the age of 3, more complex sentences appear. We only have to listen to a 3-year-old Spanish girl using sentences with the subjunctive forms to wonder how on earth this comes about. Needless to say, many theories have been put forward to explain the nature of the acquisition process, but, as we have seen, it is absolutely natural. In the area of foreign language learning, many linguists have attempted to claim that students of foreign languages can follow the same stages and thus acquire the new language. This, to be perfectly honest, is not really possible, but we can have a quick look at some of the ideas that have been suggested. Back in the 1950s, the behaviorists saw foreign language learning as a process of imitation and reinforcement. They considered that learners could transfer structures and sounds from their own language to the foreign language, thus establishing a series of acceptable habits. Others thought differently. What we know of as the cognitive view credits learners with the ability to work out rules in the foreign language for themselves. Stephen Krashen, an influential American linguist, was the first to see a sensible relationship between acquisition and learning. He saw learning as a conscious process which monitors acquisition and which progresses in the same way as with one's mother tongue. He put forward different hypotheses, which I will now examine in more detail. According to Krashen, acquisition involves the subconscious acceptance of knowledge where information is stored in the brain through the use of communication. This is the process used for developing native languages. Learning, on the other hand, is the conscious acceptance of knowledge about a language, that is to say, the grammar or form. Krashen states that this is often the product of formal language instruction. According to this theory, the optimal way a language is learned is through natural communication. The monitor hypothesis explains how acquisition and learning are used. The acquisition system initiates an utterance, and the learning system monitors the utterance to inspect and correct errors. Krashen states that monitoring can make some contribution to the accuracy of an utterance, but that its use should be limited. He suggests that the monitor can sometimes act as a barrier, and it forces the learner to slow down and focus more on accuracy as opposed to fluency. According to Krashen, learners acquire parts of language in a predictable order. For any given language, certain grammatical structures are acquired early while others are left until later in the process. This hypothesis suggests that this natural order of acquisition occurs independently of deliberate teaching, and therefore teachers cannot change the order of grammatical teaching sequence. Krashen's input hypothesis suggests that language acquisition occurs when learners receive messages that they can understand, a concept also known as comprehensible input. However, Krashen also suggests that this comprehensible input should be one step beyond the learner's current language ability, in order to allow for a continuation in the progress of their language development. In Krashen's opinion, one obstacle that manifests itself during language acquisition is the affective filter. This is a screen that is influenced by emotional variables that can prevent learning. This hypothetical filter does not impact acquisition directly, but rather prevents input from reaching the language acquisition part of the brain. According to Krashen, the affective filter can be prompted by many different variables, including anxiety, self-confidence, motivation, and stress. Most of us would agree to a certain extent with those who say that grammatical structures are acquired in a predictable order. Obviously, a child will use the present simple before moving on to more complex verbal forms and tenses. The same thing will happen when learning a foreign language. One thing I have previously mentioned is the fact that children find it much easier than adults to learn languages. Correct pronunciation of a second language is much more difficult to acquire if we have been accustomed to speaking our mother tongue for, say, 20 years or more. At this point, I need to mention how the mother tongue can interfere with the learner's acquisition of the second language. If we think of a Spanish student of English, there are many positive transfers, such as the fact that both languages form the plural with the addition of s. However, there are many negative transfers, as we can immediately see if we think of things like word order. Many Spanish adjectives tend to come after the noun, as in el libro rojo, which is just the opposite of the red book in English. Many learners, quite often subconsciously, construct their own internal linguistic system between their language and the target language. This is what is known as interlanguage, and should not be confused with what has become increasingly trendy over the last couple of decades, known as Spanglish. In order to see how the learning and acquisition processes can work side by side, we need to look at the analysis and correction of errors. The behaviorists did not really take into account the fact that habits acquired in one's mother tongue can produce problems when learning a second language. A Spanish student learning English could easily come out with the sentence "I have cold" instead of "I am cold" to express "tengo frío", while the English student learning Spanish might well think that the correct form of "tengo calor" is "estoy caliente". Errors do not always come from the influence of the mother tongue. Our job as teachers is to identify the error and correct it at an early stage. If we take the sentence "the boys study English", we immediately realize that it is grammatically unacceptable. But why? It could be that the noun should be in plural, thus giving us "the boys study English". It could also possibly be a problem with the verb, as the student does not realize that the third person singular "studies" should be used. It could even be a misuse of the present simple, where the present continuous would be a better choice, giving us "the boy is studying English". Obviously, Spanish is going to interfere negatively in the learning process of English in different areas. We can find problems in pronunciation, where Spanish students would automatically place an extra "e" before "s" plus consonant constructions, giving us words like "stop" or "student". There are many problems related to grammar, especially with things like word order or verbal forms. We all know that "hablo muy bien el inglés" is "I speak English very well", and not "I speak very well the English". Double negatives do not exist in English, and most Spanish students prefer lexical verbs to phrasal verbs. Spelling can present problems, as can the large number of false friends. To conclude, in an ideal world we would not learn foreign languages but rather acquire them. In the real world, however, and especially in our world, that of secondary education, we should do our best to make the students' learning process as natural as possible. Hopefully, by the time they reach our classrooms at the age of 13 or 14, they will have already acquired part of this natural process, and therefore our job will be much easier. Let's hope so. The bibliography I have used for this theme has been The Practice of English Language Teaching by Jeremy Harmer, Second Language Acquisition and Second Language Learning by Stephen Krashen, and The Communicative Approach and Its Applications by Henry Widowson. I hope you agree with me that my theme has covered all the necessary points and that it has demonstrated the importance of using up-to-date methodological principles in our classes, something which can only be of benefit to our students.